Her car sputtered and died on a dusty road, miles from anywhere, with a strange hum vibrating from the old farm ahead. What she stumbled upon in that crumbling barn would unravel a secret so wild, it'd leave even her tough old mechanic speechless. The engine coughed one last time, and the silence that followed felt heavy, broken only by that eerie sound drifting through the air. She squinted toward the farm, its sagging roof and peeling paint barely visible in the fading light. Something about that hum pulled at her, like a whisper she couldn't ignore. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on gravel, and took a deep breath. Whatever was waiting in that barn, it was calling her forward, and she wasn't the type to turn back. The old car sat lifeless on the side of the road, its hood still warm from the long drive. She stood there, a woman in her late 60s, staring at it with a mix of frustration and resignation. She'd been a nurse for over 40 years, retired now, and this trip was supposed to be her escape, a quiet drive through the countryside to clear her head after a year that had tested her in ways she didn't like to talk about. Her husband had passed 2 winters ago, and the house felt too big, too empty. So she'd packed a bag, filled the tank, and hit the road, chasing something she couldn't quite name. But now, here she was, stranded on a stretch of nowhere, with storm clouds rolling in overhead. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain. The farm ahead looked abandoned, its windows dark, the fields overgrown with weeds. She'd passed a gas station about 20 miles back, but her phone had no signal out here, and walking that far in the gathering dusk wasn't an option. She popped the hood, peering at the engine like she might magically spot the problem, but all she saw was a tangle of metal and wires. She sighed, muttering to herself about how she should have listened to that mechanic back in town who'd warned her about the car's rattling noise. Then she heard it, a low, steady hum, like the buzz of a far-off motor. It wasn't coming from the car, though. She turned her head, listening hard. The sound seemed to drift from the farm, faint but persistent, tugging at her curiosity. She glanced back at the road, half hoping another car might roll by, but it was empty as far as she could see. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple, and a distant rumble of thunder told her she didn't have much time before the rain hit. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove box, slung her purse over her shoulder, and made up her mind. The farm was closer than anything else, and maybe someone was there, someone who could help. Or at least a dry spot to wait out the storm. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she started walking, the hum growing just a little louder with each step. The farmhouse loomed ahead. Its paint chipped and curling like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were cracked, some boarded up, and the porch sagged under the weight of time. It didn't look promising, but that sound, it was coming from somewhere nearby, and it wasn't just her imagination. She scanned the property and spotted a barn off to the side, its red paint faded to a dull gray. The big double doors were ajar, swaying slightly in the wind, and that's where the hum seemed strongest. She hesitated at the edge of the yard, her hand tightening on the flashlight. She wasn't one for ghost stories or wild adventures, not anymore, at least. But she'd spent her life fixing things, patching up people when they were broken, and that stubborn streak hadn't left her yet. If there was something in that barn, she wanted to know what it was. Maybe it was a generator, or some old machinery still chugging along. Or maybe it was nothing, and she'd laugh at herself later for being so jumpy. Either way, she wasn't going to stand out here in the rain, feeling sorry for herself. The first drops started to fall as she crossed the yard, fat and cold against her face. She picked up her pace, her heart thudding a little faster than she'd admit. The barn doors creaked as she pushed them open, the sound swallowed by the growing roar of the storm. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of hay and damp wood. She flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows, and took a step forward. The hum was louder now, vibrating in her chest, pulling her in like a thread she couldn't let go of. Whatever was waiting in there, she was about to find out. The barn doors groaned as she stepped inside, the storm's wind tugging at them behind her. Rain pattered on the roof, a steady drumbeat that mixed with the strange hum filling the air. She swung her flashlight around, the beam catching on stacks of moldy hay, rusted tools leaning against the walls, and a rickety loft overhead. The place felt frozen in time, like no one had been here in years, but that sound, low and constant, told her something was alive in here, something hidden. She wasn't sure if she should be scared or excited, but her old nurse's instincts kicked in. When you hear a heartbeat, you follow it. Her boots thudded softly on the wooden floor as she moved deeper, the hum growing stronger with every step. Shadows danced in the corners, making her jump once or twice, but she shook it off. She'd seen enough in her life, bloody emergencies, quiet goodbyes, to know fear was just a feeling, not a wall. The beam of light slid over the walls, and that's when she saw them, strange markings scratched into the wood. They weren't random doodles, too sharp, too deliberate. Lines and curves twisted into shapes she couldn't make sense of, like a code or a map. She ran her fingers over one, feeling the grooves, and frowned. Who'd done this? And why? Then she spotted something else, faded photographs pinned up near the markings. She stepped closer, her breath catching. The pictures were old, their edges curling, showing a family, a man in overalls, a woman with a tired smile, and two kids grinning at the camera. One photo had a date scribbled on it, 1958. The man's face stuck with her, hard lines, deep-set eyes, like he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. She wondered what had happened to them, why this place was left to rot. The hum pulsed louder now, almost like it was answering her. She turned, following the sound, and her flashlight landed on a pile of hay in the corner. It looked ordinary enough, but the hum was coming from there, beneath it. She hesitated, her heart thumping hard against her ribs. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing through the cracks in the walls, and for a second, she thought about turning back. She could wait in the car, hope the mechanic showed up soon. But that stubborn streak flared up again. She'd come this far, hadn't she? She set the flashlight down, its beam pointing at the hay, and started pulling it aside. It was heavier than it looked, damp and clinging together, but she kept going, her hands steady from years of practice. Underneath, she found a trapdoor, wooden, weathered, with a rusted metal ring for a handle. The hum was unmistakable now, vibrating up through the floorboards, making her palms tingle. She knelt, brushing dirt off the edges, and saw more of those strange markings carved into the wood. Her mind raced. Was this some old farmer's secret? A stash of tools or supplies? Or something stranger? She'd heard stories growing up, tales of odd lights in the sky, whispered over coffee at the hospital, but she'd never put much stock in them. Until now. She gripped the ring, the cold metal biting into her skin, and tugged. The trapdoor creaked but didn't budge. She tried again, harder, her muscles straining, and it finally gave way with a loud scrape. Dust puffed up, making her cough, and she waved it off, peering down into the darkness below. A rickety ladder led into a cellar, the hum so loud it filled her head. She grabbed the flashlight, her hands trembling, not from fear, she told herself, but from the thrill of it. Whatever was down there, it was waiting for her. She could feel it, like a pull she hadn't felt since the days she'd raced into an operating room to save a life. She took a deep breath, the damp air sharp in her lungs, and swung her legs onto the ladder. The storm thundered above, but she barely heard it now. One step down, then another, and the barn faded away. She was going in, and there was no turning back. The ladder creaked under her weight as she climbed down, each step echoing in the narrow space. The air turned colder, damper, and the hum grew so strong it buzzed in her teeth. She hit the bottom, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt floor, and swung her flashlight around. The cellar was small, its stone walls slick with moisture, and the beam caught on cobwebs dangling like old curtains. She'd expected something ordinary, maybe a stash of canned goods or a broken tractor part, but this felt different, heavier. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, pulling her forward. In the center of the room sat an old radio, its dials cracked and dusty, but it was alive, crackling with static. The hum poured from it, steady and unbroken, like a heartbeat that wouldn't quit. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, and saw a wooden table beside it, littered with junk, a rusted canteen, a few loose nails, and a leather-bound journal, its cover worn thin. Next to that was a wooden box, no bigger than a bread loaf, locked tight with a padlock that looked older than she was. She ran her fingers over the journal, feeling the rough edges, and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but legible, written in a tight, shaky hand. She skimmed the first entry, June 12, 1959. Saw it again last night. Bright as the sun, hovering over the field. Told the wife to stay inside, but she's scared. Don't know what it wants. Her stomach tightened. She flipped ahead, her eyes racing over the words. July 3rd. It landed. Left something behind. Hid it down here. Can't let them take it. The last entry was smeared, like it had been written in a hurry. They're coming. Have to go. If anyone finds this, keep it safe. No name, no signature, just those words, raw and desperate. She set the journal down, her hands trembling now, and turned to the radio. It didn't make sense. How was it still working? No plug, no wires, just that endless hum cutting through the static. She tapped it, half expecting it to sputter out, but it didn't. Outside, the storm roared, rain hammering the barn above, and a clap of thunder made her jump. She glanced at the box, her mind spinning. Whatever the farmer had found, whatever he'd hidden, it was in there. She could feel it. She grabbed the canteen and tried prying the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Her nurse's hands, steady from years of stitching wounds, fumbled with the effort. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and stared at the setup, the radio, the journal, the box, like pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand yet. The farmer's words stuck with her, left something behind. What could it be? A tool? A weapon? Or something wilder, something tied to those lights he'd seen? She'd laughed off stories like that once, but down here, in the flickering glow of her flashlight, they didn't seem so funny. The cellar walls felt closer now, the air thick with damp and secrets. She picked up the journal again, flipping through, looking for clues. One page had a rough sketch, lines and dots, maybe a map, pointing to the fields outside. Her heart thudded. There was more to this. More to find. She wasn't just a stranded traveler anymore, she was part of something bigger, something that had waited decades to be uncovered. The thought lit a fire in her, the same spark she'd felt rushing to save a patient on the edge. She tucked the journal under her arm and gripped the box, determined to get it open somehow. The hum pulsed louder, like it knew she was close. She climbed back up the ladder, her legs shaky but her mind sharp, and pushed the trapdoor open. Rain lashed her face as she emerged into the barn, the storm wilder than ever. She didn't know what she'd stumbled into, but she wasn't stopping now. Whatever was in that box, whatever the farmer had died to protect, she'd find it, and figure out why it mattered. The barn doors rattled as she stood there, clutching the journal and the locked box, rain dripping from her hair. The storm had turned the world outside into a blur of gray, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still down in that cellar, replaying the farmer's words. It landed. Left something behind. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the rumble of an engine until headlights cut through the gloom, bouncing over the uneven ground. A battered tow truck rolled up, its tires crunching gravel, and a man climbed out, shielding his face from the rain with a weathered hand. He was in his 70s, broad-shouldered but stooped, with a gray beard and a scowl that looked permanent. His jacket was patched at the elbows, and his boots were caked with mud, like he'd spent his life fixing things that didn't want to be fixed. "You the one who called about a car?" he shouted over the wind, squinting at her through the downpour. She nodded, stepping out from the barn's shadow, and he trudged over, eyeing her like she'd lost her mind. "What are you doing out here in this mess?" She held up the box and journal, her voice steady despite the cold creeping into her bones. "Found something. In there." She jerked her head toward the barn. His scowl deepened, but he followed her inside, muttering about crazy folks and storms. The hum was softer up here, muffled by the rain, but it still buzzed in the air. She set the box on a hay bale and opened the journal, pointing to the sketchy map and the farmer's shaky handwriting. "This place, it's not what it looks like. Something happened here, years ago." He wiped rain from his face, peering at the pages with a grunt. Looks like a bunch of nonsense to me. Old man probably drank too much and saw stars. But his eyes lingered on the words, and she caught a flicker of doubt in them. She'd seen that look before, patients brushing off pain they didn't want to admit. It's not nonsense, she said, tapping the box. He hid something. This radio down there, it's still running, no power, nothing. And this, she shook the box, the contents rattling faintly. We need to open it. He crossed his arms, water dripping from his sleeves. Lady, I'm here to tow your car, not play treasure hunter. But she didn't back down. She'd spent years talking people into things, patients into treatment, families into hope, and she wasn't stopping now. Just help me with this, she said, her voice firm. Then you can tow me anywhere you want. He sighed, long and loud, but pulled a toolbox from his truck and stomped back over. Together, they worked the lock, his crowbar bending the old metal until it snapped with a dull crack. The lid creaked open, revealing a jumble inside, a handful of tarnished metals, a folded map, and a letter in an envelope so brittle it nearly tore when she touched it. She unfolded the map first, hand-drawn, with an X marked in the fields beyond the barn. The letter was next, the ink faded but clear enough. To whoever finds this, I saw it come down, 1959. Left a machine. Hid it where they wouldn't look. Tell someone, but be careful. They're still watching. Her hands shook as she handed it to him. He read it, his jaw tightening, then tossed it back like it burned. You believe this hogwash? Flying saucers and secret machines? But his voice wasn't as sharp now, and his eyes darted to the map. She smiled faintly. Don't have to believe it. Just have to see it. She grabbed the flashlight, the box under her arm, and headed for the doors. You coming? He stood there, rain drumming around them, then swore under his breath and followed. The storm lashed at them as they crossed the yard, but she felt alive, more than she had in years. He grumbled behind her, but she heard something else in his tone now, curiosity, maybe even a spark of wonder. Whatever was out there, they'd face it together, two old souls chasing a mystery neither could let go. The rain stung their faces as they trudged across the field, the map clutched tight in her hand. Mud sucked at their boots, slowing them down, but she kept her eyes on the spot marked with that shaky X. The storm churned the sky into a mess of black and purple, lightning flashing just enough to light their way. The mechanic trailed behind, his flashlight beam bouncing over the ground, his grumbles lost in the wind. She could feel it now, the hum from the barn wasn't just behind them, it was ahead, too, faint but growing, like a thread pulling them deeper into the night. She stopped at a patch of earth that looked no different from the rest, wet grass, a few rocks, but the map said this was it. She knelt, her knees sinking into the mud, and brushed at the ground with her hands. The mechanic loomed over her, his light steady. You're gonna catch your death out here, he said, but he didn't walk away. She ignored him, digging with her fingers until they hit something hard. Metal. She scraped faster, uncovering a rusted hatch, its edges caked with dirt. The hum was loud now, vibrating up through her palms. Help me, she said, glancing up. He hesitated, then dropped to one knee, prying at the hatch with his crowbar. It groaned and popped open, revealing a shallow pit. Inside sat a machine, small, no bigger than a toolbox, its surface dull and dented but strangely smooth, like nothing she'd ever seen. Tubes and wires snaked around it, and a faint green glow pulsed from a crack in its side. The hum poured out, steady and alive. She stared, her breath catching, and the mechanic's jaw dropped, his flashlight trembling in his hand. What in God's name, he muttered, leaning closer. She reached for the journal, flipping to the farmer's last pages, her voice shaking as she read aloud. It fell from the sky, quiet as a feather. Worked it out, it's no weapon, no toy. It's alive, in its way. Kept it running, hid it here. Don't know what it does, but it's not theirs to take. She looked up, her eyes wide. He found this, whatever it is, and protected it. The mechanic shook his head, but he couldn't look away. Ain't possible. Things don't just fall from the sky and sit here humming for 60 years. Yet there it was, undeniable, glowing softly in the rain. She touched it, her fingers brushing the cool metal, and the hum shifted, louder for a moment, then softer, like it knew she was there. Her heart raced. This wasn't just some farmer's delusion. It was real, a piece of something bigger than them, something that could change everything. "We can't leave it here," she said, her voice firm. He wanted someone liberal to find it, to tell the world. The mechanic rubbed his beard, rain dripping from his nose. "Tell who? Folks'll think we're nuts. Or worse, they'll come looking." She saw the flicker in his eyes, fear, maybe, but excitement too. She stood, mud streaking her coat, and met his gaze. "Then we figure it out. Together. We owe him that much." He snorted, but it wasn't a no. They hauled the machine out, heavier than it looked, and carried it back to the barn, the storm raging around them. Inside, they set it down, water pooling at their feet, and stood there, staring. She felt a rush, pride, wonder, a spark she hadn't known since her nursing days. The mechanic scratched his head, his tough shell cracking. "Been fixing cars 50 years. Never seen nothing like this." His voice softened. "Lost my wife a while back. Been alone since. This is something." She nodded, feeling the weight of her own losses lift just a little. The farmer's secret had brought them here, two strangers with nothing left to lose, and now they had a purpose. The machine hummed between them, a mystery tying their fates together. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it was theirs to unravel, and the truth was just beginning to unfold. The barn was quiet now, the storm fading to a soft drizzle outside. The machine sat between them, its faint glow casting shadows on the walls. She wiped mud from her hands, her coat soaked through, but she didn't care. The mechanic stood nearby, his arms crossed, staring at the thing like it might sprout legs and walk off. They'd spent the last hour talking, arguing, really, about what to do. She wanted to tell someone, to share the farmer's story with the world. He wasn't so sure. "Folks don't take kindly to crazy talk," he'd said. "And this? This is crazy." But she saw the spark in his eyes, the same one she felt. They weren't kids anymore, life had worn them down, taken things they couldn't get back, but this was different. This was a chance to matter again. She picked up the journal, its pages damp but intact, and traced the farmer's words. "He didn't hide this for nothing," she said. "He wanted it found, wanted it to mean something. We can't just bury it again." The mechanic sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, but he didn't argue this time. They decided to start small. The next morning, with her car towed and the machine stashed in his truck, they drove to a little town nearby. He knew a guy, a historian who ran a dusty museum full of old tractors and war relics. They hauled the machine in, set it on a table, and told the story, the barn, the journal, the lights in the sky. The historian, a wiry man with thick glasses, listened without blinking. When they finished, he adjusted his specs and leaned over the machine, muttering about alloys and frequencies. "Could be something," he said finally. "Need time to study it." Word spread slow at first, a local paper ran a piece, calling it the farmhouse mystery. Then a university professor got wind of it, and soon, people were showing up at the mechanic's shop, asking questions. He grumbled about the attention, but she caught him smiling once or twice, showing off the medals from the box like they were his own. She helped too, piecing together the farmer's life from records and old neighbors. He'd been a quiet man, they said, who'd vanished one day, leaving his family behind. No one knew why, until now. The machine stayed a puzzle. Experts poked at it, argued over it, but no one could say for sure what it was. Some called it a hoax, others whispered about stars and visitors. She didn't care much for the theories. For her, it was enough that it brought people together, curious folks, lonely souls, all looking for a little wonder. She and the mechanic stuck close through it all, an unlikely pair. One night, over coffee at his shop, he opened up. Wife used to say I'd rust away alone, he said, his voice low. Didn't think I'd find anything worth waking up for again. She nodded, stirring her cup. Lost my husband 2 years back. Felt like I was just waiting to fade out. Then this happened. She tapped the journal on the table. Gave me a reason to keep going. He looked at her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen, and they sat there, the hum of the machine faint in the background. It wasn't love, not like in the movies, but it was something, friendship, maybe, forged in mud and mystery. In the end, they didn't solve the world's secrets. The machine stayed a marvel, a quiet hum in the museum, drawing crowds who'd never know the full story. But for her and the mechanic, it was a lifeline. She found peace in the adventure, a way to heal the ache she'd carried. He found company, a crack in his loneliness. And the farmer's wish came true, his secret lived on, lighting up lives he'd never meet. Life, she realized, wasn't about the big answers. It was about the small steps, the courage to chase a hum in the dark, the grit to dig through the mud, the heart to share it with someone else. No matter how old you get, how broken you feel, there's always a barn waiting, a mystery calling. All you have to do is open the door.